Crime and punishment. If no one ever suspected him. A what-if classic story. Chapter 1: The Theory. On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards K Bridge. His name was Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, and he had once been a student, and he was now nothing in particular, which is a difficult thing for a proud man to be. He lived in a room under the roof of a tall 5-storied house, a room more like a cupboard than a place for a person, a yellow, dusty, low-ceilinged box in which a tall man could not stand fully upright, and in which Raskolnikov, who was tall, had taken to lying on his narrow couch for whole days at a time, not sleeping, not reading, only thinking. He had given up his lessons. He had given up almost everything. He owed money to his landlady and avoided her on the stairs the way a man avoids a creditor and a witness both. And he had grown so thin and so pale and so withdrawn into himself that the people of the quarter had stopped expecting anything of him at all. It was in this condition, lying in the yellow box under the roof through the long white nights of the Petersburg summer, that Raskolnikov had given birth to his theory. The theory was this: the mass of mankind, the ordinary people, the material of history, existed only to be ruled and used and, when necessary, stepped over. They were not bad, they were simply common, and their function was to obey, to multiply, to fill the world, and to be governed. But here and there, rarely at long intervals, nature produced a different kind of man, the extraordinary man. The man with something new to say, the lawgiver, the founder, the one who moved the world forward, and such a man, Raskolnikov reasoned, could not be bound by the rules made for the common herd. If a Newton or a great lawgiver required, for the sake of his idea, the sake of the new word he had come to bring, the removal of 10 men or 100 or 1,000, then he had the right, the inner right, to step over them. History absolved such men. History, indeed, was made of nothing else. The crime of the extraordinary man was not a crime at all. It was the privilege of his nature, the proof of what he was. And Raskolnikov, lying in his coffin of a room, had come to a question that he could not put down. The question was not whether the theory was true. He was certain it was true. The question was simpler and far more dangerous. The question was, which kind of man am I? For a man cannot know from the inside whether he is a Newton or a louse. Both feel to themselves like the center of the world. The common man and the extraordinary man both wake in the morning behind the same pair of eyes and feel themselves to be a self, a someone, a person of consequence. There is no inner sign. There is no mark on the soul that says, "You are permitted, you are one of the few, the rules do not apply to you." The only way to know, Raskolnikov had come to think through the long sleepless nights, the only proof a man could ever have was to act, to do the forbidden thing, and to see, afterward, whether he could bear it. The extraordinary man steps over and feels nothing, because there is nothing for his nature to feel. The common man steps over and is destroyed by it, crushed by his own ordinary conscience, because conscience is only the herd instinct turned inward, the rules of the many speaking in the voice of the one. The deed itself was the examination. To kill and to feel nothing was to pass it. There was an old woman, a pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, a shrunken, malicious, useless old creature who lent money at cruel rates to desperate people and beat her gentle half-sister, and was, by every measure Raskolnikov could apply, a louse herself, a worthless thing whose death would harm no one and free a little money that might be used for 100 good purposes. She was, his theory whispered to him, the perfect proof. The arithmetic was clean. One useless life against the testing of a question that would decide the whole meaning of his own. A man who could do this and bear it would know forever what he was. He did not believe, even as he planned it, that he would really do it. Right up until the hour, it had the unreality of a thought. And then the hour came in the heat of early July, and the old woman was alone, and the axe was under his coat, and the thought, with a terrible quiet, became a deed. Chapter 2: The Deed. He did it. The details do not need to be lingered over, and Raskolnikov afterward would have given the whole of his soul to be rid of them, but they would not leave him. The narrow, dark entry, the old woman's suspicious face at the door, the chain, the bundle he had brought as a pretext, a fake pledge wrapped to look like a silver cigarette case, tied so cunningly that it could not be quickly undone, so that she would have to turn away to the light and bend over it. The axe which he drew from the loop he had sewn inside his coat, the blow brought down with the blunt edge on the crown of her head once, and then when she did not fall at once again, the way she sank, the blood which was not as he had imagined it. And then the thing he had not planned for, the thing the theory had no place for, the half-sister, Lizaveta, the gentle, simple soul whom even Raskolnikov pitied, come back unexpectedly into the flat, standing in the inner room and seeing what had been done, her hand rising to her face, too frightened even to scream. He killed her too. He had to. There was no theory in it now, no arithmetic, no extraordinary man stepping over the common herd for the sake of a new word. There was only a terrified man with an axe, killing a witness, the most ordinary murder in the world, the murder any cornered criminal commits, and he brought the axe down on the gentle face of a woman who had never harmed a living thing, and that was the second blow, and it was the one that mattered. He took some money. He took some pledges, trinkets, a purse, things he stuffed into his pockets without looking, and he very nearly was caught on the stairs as two men came up to the flat, and he hid in an empty apartment on the floor below while they knocked and grew alarmed. And then he got out into the street, into the great indifferent heat of the Petersburg evening, with blood drying on the inside of his coat and the axe back in its loop, and he walked home through the crowds. An invisible man carrying the heaviest thing in the world. He hid the things. He had the presence of mind, even half delirious, to hide what he had taken under a stone in a deserted courtyard, never to be touched again, never even counted, for it was never the money he had wanted. He washed the blood from the coat. He slept and woke into a fever and was ill for days, raving, watched over by the friends and family he could not bear to be watched by. And through all of it there was one fact, one single fact, that pressed on him harder than the deed itself. He felt it. This was the thing the theory had not allowed for. He had done the forbidden deed, and he did not feel nothing. He felt everything. He felt a horror so total that it cut him off from the whole human race, a sense that he had stepped not over the old woman, but over some invisible line out of the world of living men into a sealed gray country where no warmth could reach him, where he could sit in a room full of people who loved him and be as alone as a man in a sunken ship. He could not eat at the same table as his mother. He could not bear the touch of his sister's hand. He flinched from kindness as from a blow. The deed had not proved him extraordinary. The deed, by the very fact that he could not bear it, seemed to be proving, hour by hour, the opposite. And so Raskolnikov began to want, with a craving deeper than hunger, the one thing his theory had taught him to despise. He began to want to be caught. Chapter 3. The Net That Never Closes. In the story as it is usually told, the wanting is answered. In the usual telling there is an examining magistrate, Porfiry Petrovitch, a clever, mild, terrible man who fastens on Raskolnikov early, who plays with him as a cat plays, who never has a shred of proof but who knows, who has read Raskolnikov's own published article on the extraordinary man and has divined the whole of him from it, and who circles closer and closer through long conversations that are really interrogations, until at last he says to Raskolnikov, quietly, "You are the murderer," and waits, and lets him go, knowing he will come of his own accord. In the usual telling there is the suffering girl, Sonia, the pure soul driven to the streets to feed her family, to whom Raskolnikov confesses everything because he cannot hold it alone, who tells him to go to the crossroads and kiss the earth he has defiled and confess aloud to all the world. In the usual telling he confesses and is tried and is sent to Siberia, and there in the prison camp, with Sonia following him into exile, he begins at the very end, slowly, painfully, to be reborn, to put down the theory and take up something larger, and the door of a new life opens, and the suffering has a shape and a purpose and an end. That is the usual telling. In that telling the punishment comes, and the punishment, terrible as it is also the cure. The net closes, and the closing of the net is the thing that lets him become, at last, a man among men again, carrying his guilt openly into the daylight where it can be borne because it is shared, because it is named, because the world has taken its half of it. But this is the other telling. This is the telling in which the net never closes. In this telling, Porfiry Petrovitch never fixes on him. There is no article. In this telling, Raskolnikov never published the piece on the extraordinary man, and so there is nothing for a clever magistrate to read his soul out of. The investigation is real and competent, and it follows the evidence, and the evidence does not point at Raskolnikov, because in his fever and his terrible luck he left almost none, and what little there was pointed elsewhere. A workman, a painter who had been in the empty flat on the floor below, fell under suspicion through a coincidence of pledges and confused testimony, and in his fright and his drunkenness and his strange peasant longing to suffer, this man confessed, falsely, to the whole thing, and the confession, though it did not perfectly fit well enough and closed the case. Another man went to Siberia for what Raskolnikov had done. And Raskolnikov, who had wanted with his whole soul to be caught, watched the net close on someone else, and felt it lift away from himself forever, and understood slowly, over the weeks in which the case was concluded and forgotten, that he had gotten away with it, completely, cleanly. That no magistrate would ever come for him, that no crossroads waited, that no Siberia, no shared and nameable suffering, no door of a new life through the gate of confession would ever open for him, because there would be no confession, because there would be nothing to confess to a world that had already neatly filed the matter and moved on. He had committed the perfect crime, and he discovered, standing in the July street the day the wrong man was sentenced, that the perfect crime is a sentence too, and that it does not end. Chapter 4: The Two Doors. He had thought there were two possible outcomes, and that he knew what each one meant. He had thought, either I am caught, which proves I am common, a louse, a man crushed by the ordinary conscience of the herd, or I am not caught, which leaves open the possibility that I am extraordinary, one of the few, a man who steps over and is absolved by history. He had walked toward the deed believing these were the two doors, and that the second was the door of his hope, the door behind which his theory might still be true and he might still be the man he needed to be. He stood now on the far side of the second door, and he saw that he had understood nothing. For the second door, the door of getting away with it, did not lead where he had thought. He had imagined that not being caught would feel like freedom, like vindication, like the cool, clean nothing that the extraordinary man was supposed to feel. It felt like none of these things. It felt like being buried alive in a house with all the lamps lit. He went on living. He took up his lessons again after a while because a man must eat. He was kind to his mother who never knew. He saw his sister married well. He walked the streets of Petersburg a free man, suspected by no one, accused by no one, a respectable young man with a future. And inside him, every hour of every day, the question he had killed to answer turned and would not stop, and now it could never be answered because he had closed off, with his own perfect success, the only thing that could have answered it. For here was the trap, the real trap, the one the theory had hidden from him. He had killed in order to find out which kind of man he was. The deed was to be the examination, but the deed had given an ambiguous result, and only the consequence could have made it clear. If he had been caught and broken and had confessed in agony, that would have meant one thing, that he was common, that his conscience was the herd instinct, that he could not bear what an extraordinary man bears, and he would have known with a terrible certainty exactly what he was. And there is a kind of peace in certainty, even the certainty of being nothing. And if he had been caught and had felt nothing, had stood at his trial cold and untouched and gone to Siberia as to an inconvenience, that would have meant the other thing, that he was one of the few, and he would have known that too. But he had been caught by no one. The examination had been administered, and the result had been sealed in an envelope that would never be opened. He felt the horror, yes, the unbearable horror of the sealed gray country, the inability to sit at his mother's table. By the logic of his own theory, this proved he was common, a louse, crushed by conscience. And yet a true louse, surely, a truly common man would have broken by now, would have run to the police, would have screamed it in the street, would have done what the painter did and confessed out of sheer inability to hold it. And Raskolnikov did not break. He held it. Year after year, he held it in silence, alone, and a man who can hold such a thing in perfect silence for years, is that not perhaps the mark of the extraordinary man after all? Or is the holding itself only a subtler form of cowardice, the louse too proud to admit he is a louse? He could not tell, he could never tell. Every piece of evidence about his own nature pointed both ways at once. His suffering proved he was common. His endurance of the suffering proved he might be rare. His refusal to confess proved he was either too strong for the herd or too weak to face the herd's justice. And there was no third party to break the tie, because the one judge who could have ruled on the case, the law, the world, the crossroads, the closing net, had looked at his crime and seen another man's face and moved on. He was left to be his own magistrate, prosecutor, witness, and accused, in a trial that could reach no verdict, that would convene every morning when he woke and adjourn every night without a finding, for the rest of his natural life. This was the punishment, not Siberia. Siberia would have been an answer. This was the absence of any answer forever, the question kept eternally open by the very success that was supposed to have settled it. He had wanted to know whether he was a Newton or a louse, and the perfect crime had given him the one outcome his theory had never imagined, that he would spend his whole life not knowing, and that the not knowing would eat him more slowly and more thoroughly than any prison could have, because a prison has walls and a sentence has an end, and this had neither. Chapter 5. Sonya. There was the girl. Even in this telling there was Sonya Semyonovna, for she was not summoned by the crime but by the world, by the poverty next door, by the drunken father trampled under a carriage and the dying stepmother and the children with nothing to eat. And Raskolnikov came to know her, as he had in every telling, through the wreck of the Marmeladov family, and was drawn to her, the meek girl with the great suffering eyes who had sold herself to feed children who were not even her own and had kept through all of it. A faith so simple and so total that it seemed to Raskolnikov at once the most foolish and the most enviable thing in the world. In the usual telling, Raskolnikov confesses to Sonya. It is the turning of the whole book. He goes to her room and he tells her, who killed Lizaveta, the gentle Lizaveta whom Sonya herself had loved, and Sonya does not recoil but takes his suffering onto herself and weeps, and tells him to go and confess to all the world and take up his cross, and her love and her faith become the thread by which he is, in the end, pulled back into the human race. And in this telling, Raskolnikov goes to her room too many times over many months and sits with her, and they speak of everything, and more than once, more than 100 times, the confession rises in his throat. She is the one person on earth to whom he could say it. He knows it. He feels that she would not turn from him, that she would take it as she takes everything, with that bottomless meekness that is somehow also the deepest strength he has ever encountered. The words are in his mouth. I killed her. I killed them both. I killed your friend Lizaveta. Only say it and the silence breaks, and you are no longer alone in the sealed gray country, and a hand reaches in. And he does not say it. He cannot. And the reason he cannot is the cruelest turn of all, the turn that completes his ruin. In the usual telling, he confesses to Sonya because he has been caught, or as good as caught, because Porfiry is closing in, because the deed is going to come out anyway, and he might as well say it to the one who loves him first. The confession to Sonya is real and free, but it stands on the ground of a crime that is becoming public. He confesses because his guilt is already, in a sense, leaving the realm of the secret and entering the realm of the shared. But in this telling, no one is closing in. No one will ever close in. And so to confess to Sonya would be to do a thing he finds, when it comes to it, he is not extraordinary enough and not common enough and not anything enough to do. It would be to hand this beautiful, suffering, undeserving girl a secret that would bind her forever, that she could never set down, that she would carry to her own grave, and to do it for no reason but his own relief, when he could, if he only kept silent, spare her entirely. The painter has gone to Siberia. The case is closed. If Raskolnikov says nothing, Sonya lives out her life with her simple faith intact, never knowing that the friend beside her crushed Lizaveta's gentle skull. If he speaks, he saves himself from his loneliness by destroying her peace, by making her an accomplice in silence, by laying on her meek shoulders a weight she did not earn and cannot share with anyone and cannot give back. And so the very thing that might have saved him, he denies himself, out of the one decent impulse left in him, the impulse to spare her. He had killed a useless old woman by the cold arithmetic of his theory, and now, by a warmer and more honest arithmetic, he calculated that his own salvation was not worth Sonya's peace, and he kept his silence, and in keeping it he sealed himself more completely into the gray country than any magistrate could have done. He loved her. That was why he could not tell her, and because he could not tell her, he could not be saved by her, and the love that in the usual telling was the open door became, in this one, the last door he closed with his own hand, gently, from the inside, so that she would never hear it shut. Chapter 6. The Years. He married her. It surprises no one who knew them in this telling, the quiet, respectable scholar and the meek girl with the suffering eyes who had, by then, with help, left her terrible trade and become merely poor, which in Petersburg was no shame at all. They married, and they were by every appearance happy, or at least content, which most people cannot tell from happy, and which is in any case all that most people get. He took a post. He published in time dry scholarly things, well regarded in small circles. They had no children, which Sonya grieved quietly and he did not, for reasons he never examined too closely. They grew older in a modest flat with books and an icon in the corner before which Sonya prayed every evening and Raskolnikov did not. And they were, the neighbors all agreed, a devoted couple, the husband a little cold perhaps, a little withdrawn, a thinker, you know how they are, but a good man, a decent man, kind to his wife and honest in his dealings and respected by all. A good man, a decent man, respected by all. He heard these words said of himself across the years, at dinners, in the street, in the warm remarks of colleagues, and each time he heard them something in him that he could not name turned over slowly in the dark. For he alone knew what stood behind the respectability, the same thing that had stood behind the respectability of every comfortable man he had ever envied or despised. Nothing certain, nothing examined, a sealed envelope, a question never answered. He was a respected man, and he had crushed 2 women's skulls with an axe, and no one would ever know. And the 2 facts sat side by side in him without ever resolving into a verdict, year after year, as his hair grayed and his back bent and Sonya's gentle face grew lined and her hands grew old upon the rosary. And the question never left him. He had thought in the early years that it would fade, that time would wear it smooth, that a man could get used to anything. And it was true that the horror faded, the raw red horror of the first months, the inability to sit at a table. That dulled as all things dull. But the question did not dull. The question only deepened because every year that passed without consequence added itself to the case and changed nothing and clarified nothing. At 23 he had not known whether he was a Newton or a louse. At 50 he still did not know, and the not knowing had had 30 years to grow, and it had filled the whole of him, so that there was very little left of Rodion Romanovitch that was not the unanswerable question, the trial without a verdict, the louse who might be a Newton, the Newton who might be a louse, the man who had stepped over and been neither absolved nor condemned, but simply, eternally left. Sometimes, on white summer nights, he would walk out alone across the bridges of Petersburg as he had on that first July evening, and stand looking down into the dark moving water, and think that the river, at least, would give a definite answer. But he never did it. Not out of hope by then, and not out of faith, which he did not have, but out of the same exhausted decency that had kept him from confessing to Sonya. Because his death would be a riddle she could not solve, a last cruelty laid on the one person who had given him whatever peace his life had held, and he found, even at the lowest hour, that he would rather carry the unanswerable question to the end than hand her its weight. So he walked home across the bridges every time and let himself in quietly so as not to wake her, and lay down beside her in the dark, a good man, a decent man, respected by all, and stared at the ceiling until the white night grayed into morning. Chapter 7. Sonya's God. Once near the end, he almost told her. She was dying. It was a slow illness, the kind that gives a person time, and she bore it as she had borne everything without complaint, with that maddening serene faith that the long years had not dimmed in her by a single degree. She lay in the bed by the window where the icon was, and the evening light came in, and Raskolnikov sat beside her holding her old hand in his old hand, and he felt the thing rise in his throat one last time, the confession he had held for 30 years, and he thought, now, when there is no time left for it to harm her, when she will carry it only a little way, into the dark she is already entering, now I could set it down. Now I could finally not be alone with it for 1 hour before she goes. And he looked at her face, at the peace in it, the peace of a soul that had suffered everything the world could do and had kept its faith whole, and he understood that even now, even at the very end, he could not do it, and for the same reason, only deeper. Her faith was that the world, for all its horror, was held in the hand of a God who was love. Her faith was that suffering had meaning, that the meek would be comforted, that the friend beside her was a good man worn down by a sorrow he had never explained. To tell her now would not be to share his burden. It would be to break, in her last hour, the one thing she had built her whole life upon, to let her die not in the peace of her God, but in the knowledge that the man she had loved and prayed beside for 30 years was the murderer of the gentle Lizaveta whom she too had loved. He would be buying himself 1 hour of not being alone, at the price of her eternity, as she understood eternity. He had killed Alyona Ivanovna by arithmetic, and here at the last he did the final sum of his life, and the answer was the same as it had been in Sonya's room 30 years before, that he would rather die alone with the question than let it touch her. He bent and kissed her forehead, and she smiled at him, the same meek bottomless smile, and asked him in a thread of a voice whether he believed now at the end, whether he would pray with her, just once. And Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, who had murdered 2 women and gotten away with it and spent 30 years in a sealed gray country no one else could see, looked at the dying face of the only person who had ever loved the whole of what she could see of him, and he lied gently, the last and kindest lie of his life, and said yes. Yes, he believed. And he knelt beside the bed, and he folded his hands, and he moved his lips, and Sonya, watching him pray, closed her eyes and was, for her last few breaths, perfectly happy. She died believing she had saved his soul. She had not. There was nothing to save and nothing to damn, only the open question, which her death now closed off forever from its last possible answer, for she had been the one human being who could have heard the truth and not been destroyed by it, and he had spent her too, sparing her, and now she was gone, and the secret was his alone, complete, sealed, with not one living soul left in the world who might ever have shared it. Chapter 8. The Verdict. Raskolnikov lived a few years more, alone in the flat with the icon Sonya had prayed before, which he kept though he did not believe, the way a man keeps the coat of someone he has lost. He was an old man now, and the people of the quarter knew him as a quiet, learned, solitary widower, a good man, a decent man who had loved his late wife devotedly and lived simply and harmed no one. Young people were respectful to him in the street. The priest, who did not know Raskolnikov, never came to the church, spoke well of him. He had achieved in full the thing every common man is supposed to want and the thing his theory had taught him to despise: a respectable life, an unblemished name, the good opinion of all who knew him, and the calm of a man with nothing on his conscience. He had everything but the verdict. He had killed to learn what he was, and he was dying without having learned it. He turned it over still in the long evenings by the cold stove. By every sign he was common. He had suffered, the extraordinary man does not suffer. He had been unable to sit at his mother's table, the Newton feels nothing. He had spared Sonia out of weakness, out of pity, out of the herd instinct of love that the great man rises above. He was a louse. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet a louse confesses. A louse breaks. A louse cannot hold a thing for 50 years in silence. A louse runs to the crossroads and kisses the earth and screams it out and begs for the chains, as the painter had, as the usual telling said Raskolnikov himself would have done if only the net had closed. But the net had not closed, and Raskolnikov had not broken, and a man who can carry the unbearable in perfect silence for half a century, sparing everyone around him, asking nothing, confessing nothing, enduring an unanswerable verdict every single day without once laying it on another soul, is that a louse? Is that the common man? Or is that, in the end, after all, in some bitter, unintended way, exactly the iron strength the theory had described, only turned to no purpose, spent on nothing, the extraordinary man's endurance wasted on a crime that proved nothing and a question that could not be answered, and a life that no one would ever know to admire? He could not tell. On the last evening of his life he sat by the cold stove and he could not tell, and he understood at last fully what he had done to himself on that hot July day so long ago. He had not committed a murder and escaped its punishment. He had committed a murder and chosen, by escaping, the one punishment that has no end and no answer and no possibility of grace, to be forever to himself a question with no one left to answer it. The man in the usual telling, the one who was caught, the one who knelt at the crossroads and went to Siberia and was reborn through suffering shared and named, that man was the fortunate one. That man had been given a verdict. That man had been told what he was, common, guilty, human, forgivable, and had been allowed through the long door of punishment to become it. Raskolnikov had been told nothing. He had asked the universe the only question that ever mattered to him: am I a man or a louse? And the universe, by letting him get away with it, had declined to reply, and he had spent his whole life in the silence of that non-reply, which he understood now to be the truest image of the thing his theory had left out. That there is no extraordinary man and no common man, that there is no one watching to absolve or condemn, that there is only the deed and the one who did it and the long, unbearable quiet afterward, in which a man must somehow be his own court without ever being granted the power to pass sentence. He died in the night, alone, an old respected widower, and was found in the morning by the woman who brought his bread, sitting upright in his chair by the cold stove with his eyes open, as though he were still waiting for an answer. They buried him beside Sonia. A small good crowd came. The priest said he had been a good man, a decent man who had borne the loss of his wife with Christian patience, and that he had surely gone now to his reward, and everyone agreed, and no one was lying because no one knew, because there had never been anyone to know. And the question he had killed 2 women to answer went into the ground with him, unanswered, where it remains. For there was no Siberia in this telling, and no crossroads, and no rebirth, and no God that he could find, and no punishment at all, except the only one that ever truly fit the crime, which was to get away with it completely and to live. A what-if classic's retelling,